All right, Chapter 15, Reconstruction, the Second Civil War. Reconstruction is a period after the American Civil War in which we're trying to rebuild all of America and tackle a demon that is as vicious and vile as the institution of slavery itself, or one could argue. When we look at the American Civil War, that was a physical conflict between two warring entities in America with the notion of preserving the Union for few and preserving a way of life for others. The conclusion would be the abolishment of slavery and the preservation of the Union. The Civil War was not, or you can sum up the Civil War in a matter of 4 years for sure, 1861 to 1865. But there had been a slow buildup, a slow burn on this issue of slavery. We have struggled and grappled with the institution of slavery since this nation's founding. And it culminated after, many decades in a physical conflict and ultimately the abolishment of slavery by way of the 13th Amendment. The reason why Reconstruction is referred to as the Second Civil War is because we are now that institution is gone, we now have to deal with a more internal struggle, and that will be the notion of racism in America. We can make an argument that we've been dealing with that issue since this nation's founding, for sure, and it becomes even more apparent during this period of Reconstruction, and you can argue all the way up until tomorrow that racism is an issue in this country, and it might forever be, that it's inherently American or that it's inherently human. Does not mean that we cannot strive to lessen racism, lessen discrimination, and Reconstruction was an attempt at that. I want to make it very clear right now that Reconstruction will fail. But that's not the point of learning about this era in American history. What we are going to try to take away from this chapter is the who, what, when, where, why, and how. The attempt at making America a better place will ultimately fail, and we need to figure out why. So let's jump right on into it with our first slide. In the title, it says the meaning of freedom. And a lot of times, your understanding of things usually requires some form of a standard. And what I mean by that is, for you to understand a good professor, you must have had a bad professor. There always has to be some point of comparison. In order for you to understand, the dark, you have to have experienced at one point in time some light. Good food, bad food. And for freedom, the opposite of that would be for African Americans or Africans at large, that would be enslavement. With the conclusion of the American Civil War, we now have 4 million newly freed slaves, and they are told that they are now free. But what exactly does that mean? Their knowledge of freedom is predicated upon the standard of white freedom or white existence. So if white Americans are able to move about freely, have a sense of self-ownership, establish families, participate in politics, express themselves intellectually, religiously, and economically with autonomy, if white America is able to do all those things, these newly freed slaves simply want to do just that. Not any more, not any less. They just simply want to be equal. And their standard for equality will be that of white America. They simply want to be Americans. Now, this will be difficult because many white Americans have had a legacy of freedom and opportunity. For the most part, they have not been denied because of the color of their skin. They have not been institutionalized because of their skin color. And so uh, the transition for these newly freed slaves will be difficult. In an effort to assist that transition, the federal government will create something known as the Freedmen's Bureau. I want you guys to underline that. The Freedmen's Bureau is a government agency, so I'm going to go ahead and type that out here. A government agency that sought to establish schools for newly freed slaves, provide aid and assistance to the poor and aged freed slaves, settle disputes between blacks and whites. And what I mean by that is settle disputes between former slaves and former slave masters, and secure for former slaves and white unionists equal treatment before the courts as they were settling disputes. When you have this many people now told to be freed, where are they to go? Who are they to talk to? What type of assistance is available when for generations they have been handicapped, indoctrinated by the institution of slavery? And the notion of just letting these people go and hoping that they could fend for themselves is a bit problematic. And the federal government understood that there needed to be some transition, some bridge uh, towards the notion of American equality and what that meant and how dangerous freedom can be at times. So, what the Bureau, Freedmen's Bureau, is going to try to accomplish is serve as a bridge, a conduit between a former past of slavery to a newfound form of freedom in America. Now, notice that the Freedmen's Bureau, it says there, it was from 1865 to 1870. So what that should tell you is that within it can tell you two things. One, that within 5 years they'll succeed, and from 1870 to 2020, African Americans are not going to face any type of problems, or that something happened in 1870, and that's why America deals with racial issues to this day, or is a contribution as to why America deals with these racial issues today. Nonetheless, the second bullet states that the Bureau was an experiment in government social policy. Experiment implying that we weren't sure if this was going to work. Never before had the federal government stepped into the lives of many Americans and tried to sway their hearts and minds. Yes, the federal government has been involved in economic affairs, in military affairs, economic policy, domestic policy, foreign policy, but never before has the federal government taken such an enormous step to assist American citizens by way of social policy, assisting them in their efforts to acclimate to American life, understanding that a transgression had taken place and that there was a responsibility, an obligation by the federal government to ensure that these individuals would be provided some form of assistance in transition. Now, in response to the Freedmen's Bureau, you will have some Americans argue that this was an agency to keep the Negro in idleness, as it says right here. I'm going to underline that right there. At the expense of the white man, twice vetoed by the president and made law by Congress. Support Congress and support the Negro. Sustain the president and you protect the white man. And then you can look at the picture here. It demonstrates, or it gives off this impression that black people are lazy. They're waiting on a government check. This government check comes from hardworking white Americans, and Congress is willing to give them that money so they can get votes. And we need to support our president because by supporting him, we support real America, and he's going to make America the way it should have been, and that's for the white men. You know, this is a very racist attitude, obviously, to have. You can hear this sentiment echoed to a degree in regards to today, where there's this notion that there are some people who live off the government. And don't get me wrong, we could probably look at many instances or anecdotal instances in which we can observe individuals taking advantage of a situation, for sure. You can't look at any entity, for the most part, in America, especially as capitalistic as it is, and not notice somebody taking advantage or exploiting a situation. When these individuals are doing it, and then for people to say, well, they're doing it and they're taking our tax dollars, these attitudes, they exist today, they've existed back then. And the reality, or what I would like for us to take away from this, is that this message works. It really does work. This message is easy to consume and convince many people, and ultimately um, maintain a conflict between those that have and those that have not. And there are a great deal of white Americans who are bothered at the fact that these newly freed slaves are getting treated better, are given more assistance than white Americans. And they're bothered by that. And they may not even be racist, but they're bothered at the fact that the government is willing to help the select few and not help out all Americans. And that argument is held even today when you hear when you hear that stress that, well, why does it have to be Black Lives Matter? Why isn't it all lives matter? And you'll always hear those arguments again, whether they're today or yesterday. These arguments work. You're going to have sectors of our society that support those arguments, and in reality, they're looking at the government as a problem. They're looking at minorities who are in need of assistance as a problem, and it will create conflict, undoubtedly, and make racism even more an issue. Please underline on this slide sharecropping. Sharecropping is I wouldn't call it like a business strategy, but it is a business model. So I'll type that right here. It's a business model in which former slave owners would rent out pieces of their lands to these newly freed slaves and make the cost of that rent higher than the return that the land would produce. But many former slaves with no resources, no understanding of contract, nowhere to go, maybe a lack of family. When slavery ended, many of these former slave masters would run up on their slaves and say, hey, why don't you just work for me? I can pay you. And all you got to do is sign this contract. You're going to be able to control the land, and whatever you make from the land, I'm going to want that percentage of whatever you make, and it's not going to be a lot. All I need is like 10%, and I'll be able to loan you my tools at a cost. I can probably even pay you and provide you with lodging on the plantation at a cost. And before you know it, all these costs were racking up. Sharecropping, in essence, became a scheme. Up here I said that it's a business model, but ultimately it's a scheme of exploitation. The renters of the land would be bound by contract to continue their work the land until the debts were paid off or repaid. And if and when there were ever some type of conflict, the former slave owners would notify the authorities. The authorities would come down and arrest them and put them even further into debt because they could no longer work. And it became this system of exploitation. When you look at the institution of slavery in of itself, as far as I'm concerned, any system of exploitation or exploitation is inherent in the institution of slavery. Exploitation is inherent in many business models. There's schemes by which, because how else will you turn out a profit? How else do you maximize a profit? Don't get me wrong, there are many businesses out there that could earn a respectable profit margin, but what's respectable? What's extensive? What is massive? What is too much? Is there ever such a thing as too much? In a capitalistic society, there's no such thing as that. Make as much money as you can, or be as poor as you want to be. Is the attitude. And in order to maximize profits, there's a chance you're going to probably get exploited. If a person is paying you $10 to do anything, there's a good chance that they're probably making $20 off of you doing it. That's business. These sharecroppers were taking advantage of a situation. These former slaves were naive when it came to contracts, naive when it came to business, and this will be in essence a slavery by another name. Sharecropping is slavery by another name. At this time, I want you guys to underline Johnson's Reconstruction. Remember that Andrew Johnson is the president of the United States, and he had a vision of Reconstruction, and you could make an argument that it was similar to Lincoln's version of Reconstruction. It was fairly lenient. Johnson offered pardons to nearly all white Southerners as long as they took an oath of allegiance. He appointed provisional governors to hold state conventions and establish loyal governments, but you didn't have to include African Americans. So there was no representation of African Americans in many of these so-called loyal governments. And by and large, with Johnson's Reconstruction, again, Johnson's attempt to rebuild the South, rebuild America, it was incredibly lenient. And by and large, he just simply restored the old South, minus the institution of slavery. But you can make an argument we didn't need the institution of slavery anymore because we had the economic exploitation of labor by way of sharecropping. And then we could also have the political exploitation of African Americans by way of the Black Codes. And so that's what we're going to focus on our next slide. The bottom line is, what I want you guys to take away from Johnson's Reconstruction is that it is clear he's going to his version of reconstructing America. And let's remember, Johnson is a Democrat from the South. So he is going to be empathetic. He is going to be sympathetic. And his version of Reconstruction will not solve many problems. If anything, it will create an even deeper sense of tension between those who were sincere in their efforts for change and those who wanted to maintain their way of life down south. Please underline the Black Codes. This will work in conjunction with economic exploitation of former slaves. The Black Codes were laws designed to limit the freedoms of newly freed slaves. In some cases, they were completely ignoring emancipation. Blacks could not testify against whites. They could not vote. They were forced to sign those labor contracts or be arrested. And what will motivate the North's turn, what will motivate the Republican turn against Johnson's policy was not a desire to punish white Southerners, but the inability of the South's political leaders to accept the reality of emancipation. The tension that will ultimately develop, the civil war that will develop during Reconstruction, will revolve around the issue of racism in the mind of many, especially down south, to create like this pseudo form of the old South, this pseudo form of slavery by another name. That yes, I wasn't physically holding you in bondage, but I would create a way of life in which I would economically bond you, I would mentally bond you, psychologically bond you, socially bond you. And that's exactly what the Black Codes did. It was a way in an effort to keep African Americans in a second class status. By the way, the Black Codes were often known as the Jim Crow laws as well. I'm gonna note that right here. So those are interchangeable, Jim Crow or Black Codes. Jim Crow is just the name, like a a euphemism that would be given to the black codes. Even, if you said the black codes, they'd be like, oh, that's, it's kind of problematic. You kind of know who it's aimed at. When you say Jim Crow, people could be, oh, well, we're talking about this or we're talking about that. But Jim Crow is, when you put it in front of anything, that is a very racist attitude with the intent of discriminating. Whether it's Jim Crow music, a Jim Crow theater, a Jim Crow diner, and of course, Jim Crow laws. In response to a not apathetic, but in response to President Johnson's lenient Reconstruction and Southerners' rejection of equality and emancipation, you will see the rise of radical Republicans. And I want you to underline radical Republicans. These individuals are calling for the dissolution of Johnson's so-called loyal governments. They want to establish new ones. They want old Confederate leaders taken out of government. And they want African Americans to have the right to vote. They want African Americans to have the right to participate in the rebuilding and reframing of these state governments down south. You're going to have radical Republicans like Charles Sumner. You're going to have radical Republicans like Thaddeus Stevens right here. And it's these individuals that will stand on the opposite end of the spectrum and be the chief warriors, if you will, in this second Civil War. You had the old racist Democrats of the South versus the radical Republicans, usually of the North. And they were struggling on how to define and redefine equality in America. There will be many efforts by radical Republicans to bring equality into existence as soon as possible. They're considered radical because they sincerely believed in equality. In 1866, the Republican Party had an overwhelming majority in Congress. They're going to pass two bills, one of them extending the Freedmen's Bureau, and the second one giving credence to a civil rights bill. I want you guys to underline the Civil Rights Bill of 1866, and it's going to define citizenship by way of birth. If you are born in this country, you are a citizen. Now, here's what's interesting. Why are we all of a sudden defining birth in America as citizenship? Why didn't we do it before 1866? Why didn't we do it in 1830? Why didn't we do it in 1800? Why didn't we do it in 1787? Why didn't we do it in 1776? And the reason that we've never had to issue a civil rights bill defining citizenship based on birth is because that's the presumption of being white. That when you're white, you don't need laws defining your citizenship. When you're white, it's just assumed that you, without worry, that if you're white in this country, you've got to be a citizen. But now that we have 4 million newly freed slaves, they require legislation because it's not guaranteed by their skin color that they're American. So now we have to put laws on the books to protect these individuals. Whereas if you're white, you're just a walking, living example of privilege in that sense. You don't need legislation. You can just be you, and everything's going to come to fruition. So in 1866, we get the Civil Rights Bill, and Johnson, the president of the United States, will veto both bills. If the Freedmen's Bureau was passed in 1865, and we had to vote in 1866, the very next year, to extend it, and then vote for a civil rights bill, Johnson's going to veto both bills. This is and that, it's not the first time that a president has vetoed a bill, but it will be the first time in which Congress will override his vetoes and pass the bill and extend the Freedmen's Bureau. We've never had that before. We've never had Congress say, wait a minute, Mr. President, and go back and get an overwhelming majority to override his veto. So tell that on this issue of civil rights, and by the way, notice that it doesn't say black rights, but we all know that civil rights is in reference to African Americans, because if we were to call it the Black Rights Bill or the African American Rights Bill, the rest of America would get, well, what about all Americans? And that's why the term civil is used, to make people feel good about themselves. But we have the Civil Rights Bill arguing for equality, and will give credence to the 13th Amendment, which will abolish slavery, and give credence to the 14th Amendment, which will protect your rights as a citizen. Um, we can see from this slide alone that there is a deepening rift between radical Republicans and President Andrew Johnson. By the way, I want you guys on this slide to write out Reconstruction amendments, and then underline that. Now, the Reconstruction amendments will be the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. Now, the 13th Amendment will abolish slavery. The 14th Amendment will protect the rights of all citizens by the federal government. And then the 15th Amendment will guarantee the right to vote. These are all Reconstruction amendments passed during the period of Reconstruction in America. And you got to know, and let's not even pretend that these amendments are passed to assist newly freed slaves. Bottom line, we never needed these amendments before, and then all of a sudden now we do. Let us not act like we are not aware of the elephant in the room. These are civil rights amendments. These are for African Americans, that they are recognized as freed men, protected as freed people, and should be afforded the right of every citizen, and that being the right to vote. You know, what's important about these Reconstruction amendments is that we are extending liberties during a very volatile period of American history, and they are considered successes during this period by way of radical Republicans and their efforts.